Breaking news, America's students have gone feral, and those are their teachers' words, not mine. America's youth can't read, don't pay attention, and aren't sorry about it. In short, the kids are not all right. And though we'd be wise to listen to the hordes of burnt-out teachers who've been screaming warnings into the void since long before COVID, this is America, where we like to wait until our canaries have all gone silent before getting the out of the coal mine. For the best educators, teaching is more of a calling than a job, which explains why they bothered entering the profession despite knowing they'd face daily frustrations like the low wages, micromanaging administrators, and infuriating parents that have become hallmarks of the profession. But it seems we've reached a breaking point for teachers and students. Turnover is rampant. Fewer people are being certified in the profession each year than are retiring. Schools are chronically understaffed. Students are disengaged and insulated from consequences. Mass shooter drills and the threat of real violence they imply are a fact of life. And starting next year, the person who will be at the helm of it all has more experience in the wrestling ring than in the classroom and is hell-bent on dismantling all of it. Today, we're exploring why teachers are fleeing the classroom and what's going to happen once Trump's in charge. Let's get into it. With the election season behind us, it's understandable to feel fatigued from the constant media cycle. But now more than ever, it's critical to understand media biases in order to make sense of the issues that'll shape our future. Media literacy isn't just a skill for adults, it's something we should be teaching in schools so that young people can critically engage with the headlines they see. For example, look at this recent headline. Federal judge blocks Louisiana law that requires classrooms to display 10 commandments. Ground News compiled over 200 articles on this story. You can also follow this story on ground.news/Leeja or scan the QR code. Left-leaning MSNBC uses the headline, 10 Commandments case could give Supreme Court another precedent to overturn. Whereas right-leaning WNG uses the headline, Judge blocks 10 commandments from Louisiana classrooms. This subtle shift in language creates two different narratives, with MSNBC framing the decision as a constitutional ruling and WNG as a moral deprivation. Today's partner Ground News has been my go-to tool for over a year now for staying informed and improving my own media literacy. They make it easy to evaluate news beyond the headlines with features like the bias distribution of sources covering each story, the overall factuality rating, and the ownership breakdown, showing that only about 9% of sources covering this story are independent. These features aren't just about understanding this one story. They're about building a habit of questioning and analyzing stories you consume, helping you become more aware of your own echo chamber. My favorite Ground News feature at the moment is their blind spot feed, with a bird's eye view of issues that tend to get more attention from the left or right than others. Seeing these blind spots is a powerful way to understand the narratives shaping public perception and keeping us grounded in reality as we process ongoing issues. The Vantage plan that I use makes it easier to cut through the noise and see where narratives diverge, revealing biases that might otherwise go unnoticed. For unlimited access to these features, scan my QR code, click the link in the description, or go to ground.news/Leeja for 50% off the Vantage plan, bringing it to about $5 a month. It's the best deal of the year, and subscribing not only supports my channel, but also backs an independent team dedicated to media transparency. Thanks, Ground News. Education is key to a thriving society. Studies have shown that graduates with access to quality education through primary and secondary school are more likely to find gainful employment, have stable families, and become productive and engaged citizens. They're also less likely to commit serious crimes, less likely to place high demands on the public healthcare system, and less likely to be enrolled in welfare assistance programs. Investing in public education now is far more cost-effective than footing the bill for the social and economic consequences of underfunded, low-quality schools. But it's great teachers that really make a difference in educational outcomes. Studies indicate that teachers are the single most significant factor impacting student achievement, more than services, facilities, or administrative leadership. When teachers are enthusiastic, motivated, and passionate, students are more likely to be engaged and motivated to learn. But if students perceive that their instructor has disengaged from the lesson, they're likely to disengage as well. You've probably experienced this yourself. I had a science teacher in 9th grade who was so checked out that he was using projector slides from the 1970s. I did get to watch a lot of Bill Nye the Science Guy though, but I was also equally checked out. But despite their enormous importance, teachers don't get the support they need, and they haven't for a criminally long time. In an episode from a while ago, we talked about the many ways conservatives sabotage public schools, including by interfering with curriculum, tying federal funding to standardized test scores, and waging a cultural war on expertise. Teachers were already fighting to persevere through these major challenges, and then COVID came along and said, hold my and beer. According to a recent Pew survey, the vast majority of teachers, 82%, said that schools are worse off than they were pre-pandemic and predicted an even steeper decline in the 5 years ahead. This, even though public K-12 spending has been trending upward nationwide. We're actually spending more money per student per year than ever before, just apparently not on things that would improve outcomes. For example, paying teachers what they're worth. And let me be clear, the answer to this high spending despite low outcomes problem is not to get rid of the spending altogether, as conservatives would have you believe. It's to be more strategic with the money we are spending, including paying teachers enough to make it worth their time to enter the profession to begin with and to give them the bandwidth to give all that they give of themselves to this job. Teachers, much like nonprofit workers and artists, are subject to hefty passion taxes. A passion tax, also known as enthusiasm exploitation, refers to an employer's expectation that a worker will accept lower wages and worse conditions to do a job they love. But passion doesn't pay the bills, you know what I mean? In 2022, teachers earned 74 cents on the dollar compared to workers with similar levels of education. And more than half of those public school teachers had master's degrees. In addition to making less than other comparably educated professionals, teachers' salaries also grow at slower rates than the workforce as a whole. In January 2018, the average teacher salary was about 3% less than the average salary for all other workers in the country. By October 2023, the pay gap had widened to 8%. A 2021 study calculated that raising teachers' base pay to 6 figures for effective teachers could help address public education's teacher shortage crisis. Determining a teacher's effectiveness is another can of worms, but even still, higher base pay has been proven to deepen student learning, reduce dropout rates, and narrow the achievement gap between white students and students of color. Raising base pay also curbs teacher turnover, ensuring that quality teachers remain in their classrooms instead of abandoning them in search of more lucrative jobs that don't involve regular active shooter drills. Raising the average teacher salary to 6 figures nationwide would require about $35,000 additional dollars per teacher per year. The U.S. employs more than 3 million public school teachers, making the total cost of that increase more than $100 billion per year. And this sounds like a lot until you realize that we're spending about $100 billion on Medicare every 5.5 weeks. The Pentagon's budget is over $800 billion per year, and they don't seem to know where a lot of that budget goes, given they haven't passed an audit in 7 years. And the Biden administration set aside $122 billion in American Rescue Plan elementary and secondary school emergency relief funds to eliminate educator shortages. We could come up with the money if we wanted to. It's not really about the cash, it's about our priorities. And for the past 50 plus years, conservatives have prioritized the systemic erosion of our public education system, and undermining teachers has been a major part of that work. Conservatives have spent decades painting higher education and anyone shaped by it as the enemy, including public school teachers, who, as we just covered, are a particularly educated bunch. By painting teachers as a bunch of Marxists hell-bent on indoctrinating innocent youths with woke nightmares like critical race theory and radical gay stuff, conservatives have gradually but systematically undermined teachers' authority, expertise, and independence. No Child Left Behind, the George W. Bush administration's program that tied federal funding to standardized test scores, saw teachers' classroom autonomy eroded and their expertise overruled by administrators more interested in statistics than truth. And since graduation rate is another success metric for schools, teachers are rarely allowed to fail a student or make them repeat the year. So they just keep getting pushed through to the next grade and then the next grade, and that's how the U.S. ended up with 19% illiteracy among high school graduates. Nearly 20% of the kids graduating from high school are illiterate in the United States. 21% of adults in the U.S., fully 1/5, read below a 5th grade reading level. 5th graders are 11 years old, for the record. As a former gifted and talented student, I was reading at a 5th grade level in 2nd grade. So you're telling me that there are 41-year-olds out here who can't read any better than a gifted and talented 8-year-old? In response to being micromanaged by bad metrics in the wake of No Child Left Behind, educator job satisfaction plummeted. Between 2008 and 2019, the number of new teachers completing traditional training programs dropped by more than 1/3, and the steepest declines were in areas with the greatest need for instructors, including bilingual education, science, math, and special ed. And when you listen to teachers talking about their experiences in the classroom, which is one of my favorite TikTok subgenres, it's not hard to understand why fewer than 1 in 5 Americans surveyed in 2022 said they would ever encourage a young person to become a K-12 teacher. Facing chronic staffing shortages and a lack of trained teachers, states are ushering unqualified randos into the classroom. Arizona, Florida, and Oklahoma have all lifted the requirement that teachers hold a bachelor's degree. In 2015, the Texas legislature passed a law allowing most schools to hire uncertified teachers. Supposedly, the idea was to empower hire retired professionals like doctors and mathematicians to help address the perennial teacher shortage. Instead, recruiting untrained outsiders has become a pillar of the state's hiring strategy. In 2024, more than half of all public school students in Texas were taught by uncertified teachers, even though research has shown that unregulated hiring practices tend to backfire on students, and that those consequences disproportionately affect Black students, English learners, and rural students. Underprepared teachers are more likely to quit, which has a negative impact on students' academic achievement, especially in middle and high school math, already a consistently understaffed subject. A recent study found that middle and high school students who were taught math by an unqualified first-time teacher experienced learning losses equivalent to missing 3 months of instruction. So students could lose a full third of a 9-month school year with just one unqualified hire. In 2024, more than 365,000 teachers across the U.S., and that's just from the states that reported their numbers, weren't fully certified for their teaching assignments. And in many cases, uncertified teachers get the same pay and benefits as their certified peers, begging the question, why bother get training at all? Lowering the barriers to entry for educators sounds like a way to democratize teaching, but is really just another Band-Aid solution that will further erode the already shriveling pipeline of qualified teachers in the long run. Charter schools have also helped normalize the presence of uncertified teachers in the classroom. Charter schools are private, for-profit institutions that siphon off government funding that would otherwise go to public schools, and yet they're not held to the standards that public schools are. School vouchers allow individual families and students to divert education tax dollars away from public schools to help subsidize the tuition of the private, religious, or home school of their choosing. In 2022, Arizona pioneered the largest school voucher program in the history of education, allowing any parent in the state, no matter how affluent, to cash in on a taxpayer-funded voucher with up to tens of thousands of dollars to spend on anything from private school tuition to extracurricular programs to homeschooling supplies. So rich families who could otherwise afford to send their kids to whatever private school they wanted are receiving government vouchers, handouts, some might say, not me, but some, to send their rich kids to expensive private schools on the government's dime. This year, Arizona faced a $1.4 billion budget deficit, much of which was tied to new voucher spending. Make it make sense. Private schools, religious schools, homeschools, and charter schools all operate independently of established state school regulations and oversight. Another not-so-subtle reinforcement of the increasingly popular idea that parents know best no matter what. Reminder that 20% of these parents can't read. And on the subject of parents, these days, parents tend to be either way too involved in their kids' educations or completely checked out. On the overbearing end of the spectrum are the helicopter parents. They've been empowered by online portals and made a habit of combing through every syllabus, reading assignment, and test score. Stop emailing your daughter's English teacher at 11 o'clock at night just because she posted a grade you had thoughts about. Okay, Denise? But grade grubbing is a predictable side effect of a college-centric educational system where A's have become a currency that can be exchanged for a successful future in a world where kids aren't guaranteed to outperform their parents. Grades themselves are more important than the mastery they're supposed to represent. And many parents believe their precious crotch goblins are entitled to top marks just for showing up. I mean, remember the Varsity Blues college tuition scandal? Parents are literally willing to break the law to get their mediocre kids into higher ed. Then there are the politicized parents. They're maybe less concerned about the grade than the content, but have just as much to say. They tend to believe that the entire school system should adhere to their personal beliefs, whether that means banning inclusive books or whitewashing history to skip all the racist parts. These parents are particularly likely to pull their kids out of the public school system, and thousands of them have since the pandemic. According to the Washington Post, homeschooling is now the fastest growing form of education in the U.S., and rates have increased across race groups and ethnicities. Families value the opportunity to decide exactly who and what their children are exposed to. There are also families whose kids have developmental disabilities that choose homeschooling because schools can't always provide their kids with the services that best suit their needs. 15% of all students have disabilities that qualify them for individualized education plans, or IEPs. Yet in 2022, 65% of U.S. public schools reported being understaffed in special education, and more than 78% reported difficulty in hiring special ed staff. And I'm not necessarily saying homeschooling is the wrong option here, but it certainly is for the parents who cannot read and the ones who are more concerned about indoctrinating their children with the right version of information than they are with their child's long-term personal and mental development. Finally, on the disengaged end of the parenting spectrum, there are some parents with what we'll call legitimate excuses. Maybe they're working multiple jobs, dealing with health issues, single parenting, or some other scenario that genuinely leaves them with no bandwidth to spare on policing their child's education. As you might imagine, there have been even more legitimate excuses than usual since COVID, and I'm not here to demonize people who are struggling despite doing their best. I will, however, relish in shaming the disengaged parents who could be more involved in their kids' education but just don't want to. They tend to think of themselves as customers instead of partners with their child's school. They're likely to say things to teachers like, "My taxes pay your salary," and "How could you be overworked when you get summers off?" These parents don't want to check their kids' backpack or help with their homework or read to them at night because, quite frankly, they don't appreciate being told what to do, and their resistance to modifying their own behavior often rubs off on their kids as well. Schools are desperate to get parents back on their team. According to the CDC, research shows that parent engagement in schools is closely linked to better student behavior, higher academic achievement, and enhanced social skills. And as the Harvard Graduate School of Education recently reported, schools with robust family engagement had significantly lower rates of chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism, also known as truancy, describes students who miss 10% or more of the school year, about 18 days or a little more than 3 weeks. Chronic absenteeism has emerged as a leading factor hindering the country's recovery from pandemic learning losses. Not only can the absent kids not learn when they aren't in school, their absences also disrupt students who do show up. Teachers struggle to keep their students on the same page, and students who see their peers treating class as optional are more likely to take the same approach. One study found that when 10% of a student's classmates are absent on a given day, the student who was present is significantly more likely to skip school the following day. Attendance numbers are improving, but not fast enough to recover all the lost ground. Recent counts estimate chronic absenteeism rates remain 75% higher than they were before the pandemic. Experts interpret this to mean that habits and norms around school attendance have been severely disrupted. To put it simply, for many families, the relationship with school has become optional. The habit of daily attendance, as well as the trust of many families, was shattered during the COVID closures. Remote and hybrid learning, relaxed grading and attendance policies, and the social mandate to keep kids home at the slightest sign of illness rewrote our expectations around school. And today, since many teachers are still required to post coursework online, families incorrectly believe that students are keeping up even when they aren't showing up. The root causes of chronic absenteeism are vast. Poverty, illness, a lack of childcare and social services, transportation challenges, and the youth mental health crisis have all contributed to the problem. Chronic absenteeism often leads to learning loss, which creates anxiety, which generates avoidance, which leads to absences and more learning loss. Studies show that poor attendance influences whether a student is able to read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. For 9th graders, each week of absences per semester is connected to a more than 20 percentage point decline in the probability of graduating from high school. The legal term truancy has been largely abandoned because experts agree that punitive responses to chronic absences only cause further damage to the relationship between students, families, and schools. Instead of having parents jailed for failing to get their kids to school, districts have been experimenting with alternative methods to reduce chronic absenteeism, including laundry rooms at school to accommodate students who are embarrassed to show up in unwashed clothes, pairing each chronically absent student with an adult mentor at school, providing free breakfast, and more. Private companies have also popped up to bridge the gap, deploying the gentlest possible version of truancy officers to check in on families and work with them to create and enact plans that will get their kids back in the classroom. Unfortunately, getting students to show up for school is just the first battle, because it turns out that even after they're in the door, getting them to sit down, shut up, and actually learn something can feel like going into battle. In 2023, more than 70% of educators reported that students are misbehaving more now than they did before the pandemic. The kids are not all right, and honestly, if I were in their shoes, I wouldn't be either. Growing up sucks. Your brain doesn't work right yet. It's mostly mush. Your body won't stop changing. You're trying to figure out social norms and who you are as a person, and you're constantly being told what to do. Now add social media. On TikTok, you can go from a video about how the world is burning, another of a celebrity you'll never measure up to, and another of the cutest animal you've ever seen in the span of 3 minutes, and then you do that over and over and over again for hours. The human mind was not meant to comprehend, let alone the undeveloped adolescent mind. The average teen in the US spends over 8 hours looking at screens for entertainment every day. This doesn't include the time they look at screens in the classroom for learning purposes. 8 hours on TikTok, on Instagram, playing video games, watching TV. Imagine having that level of constant stimulation before your brain is even fully formed. It was hard enough making it through the pandemic lockdowns as an adult with a fully functional frontal lobe. I cannot imagine what it was like for literal children to watch the world change overnight. I think in hindsight, it's tempting to brush over the profound confusion and anxiety and frankly trauma of those years and just talk about the sourdough craze or laugh about how many boxes of wine we went through, haha. But let's not forget, how it broke a lot of us. By March 2023, more than 1 million people in the US had died from COVID. More than 47 million Americans voluntarily quit their jobs during the Great Resignation. Nothing puts your limited time on Earth into perspective like a global pandemic, you know? Many of us were forced to come to terms with how little regard our jobs had for our well-being or fulfillment and reevaluated our priorities. Students were doing the same calculations, they just didn't have the freedom to make their own choices nor the reasoning skills to fully process what was happening. Instead, they were forced to keep working through the pandemic, even when it felt like a joke, and all while they saw their families, friends, and teachers being actively traumatized on a daily basis. When schools reopened, kids were expected to return to business as usual, just like the grown-ups, but the kids are not coping well. According to the 2022 National Healthcare Quality and Disparities Report, nearly 20%, 1 in 5 of young people in the US between the ages of 3 and 17 had a mental, emotional, developmental, or behavioral disorder. In 2024, nearly half, 48% of students reported that depression, anxiety, and stress were making it difficult for them to succeed in school. Half. And I get it. The main thing that got me through high school, despite some spicy childhood trauma and undiagnosed anxiety and ADHD, was the promise that getting into a good college would allow me to get the out of my hometown and build a better life for myself. But now that the social contract around college and career have started breaking down, the old carrots aren't as motivating. College enrollment peaked in 2010, the year I entered undergrad, and ever since then, the narrative around the American dream has been unraveling. This includes crushing student debt, the elusiveness of homeownership, and the waning relevance of a 4-year degree. And not to give the guy too much credit, but I can't help suspecting that the rise of Donald Trump has sent a really terrible message about the value of hard work generally. If a scammer and a bully who may not even be able to read real good can become president of the United States twice, why would you bother finishing Catcher in the Rye? And the value of education has been undermined not only by the decades-long conservative assault on public schools and expertise, but by the conservative example that these things do not matter. Not to mention the other conservative policies that have made wage growth stagnant and the wealth gap ever larger. Why would I work hard to go to college when the likelihood that I'll ever make a livable wage and buy a house and do all the things wrapped up in the American dream is low even with a college degree? And now that Trump got a second term with multiple felony convictions, that message should be considered the national standard. Just like Ronald Reagan before him, President-elect Trump wants to eliminate the Department of Education, which Project 2025's mandate for leadership describes as a convenient one-stop shop for the woke education cartel. Schools should be responsive to parents rather than to leftist advocates intent on indoctrination. And the more the federal government is involved in education, the less responsive to parents the public schools will be. This department is an example of federal intrusion into a traditional state and local realm. For the sake of American children, Congress should shutter it and return control of education to the states. In truth, state and local governments are already in charge of education. They provide around 90% of the funding and set most of the rules. The federal Department of Education doesn't get to dictate curriculum or shape most school policies. What it does do is administer federal grant programs, including the $18 billion Title I program that funds high-poverty K-12 schools, the $15 billion program that helps cover the cost of education for students with disabilities, and a $1.6 trillion federal student loan program which sets rules for what colleges must do to participate. The department also collects statistical data and enforces civil rights laws like the ones stopping schools from discriminating against students for their gender identity. So the reality is that once again, conservatives have identified a problem, our schools are failing our children, and then swerved completely off the cliff with the solution. State and local governments already form the backbone of the education system, and the system is failing. Removing federal funding that mostly goes to the most vulnerable students will not suddenly make the schools more responsive to parents. Parents, 20% of whom, I'll remind you, cannot read. It's unclear whether Trump and his nominated Education Secretary Linda McMahon would have the ability to fully get rid of the Department of Education. Experts are positing that instead the department will be used to funnel more money into school choice, meaning voucher programs that give away federal dollars to be used on private, for-profit institutions or loosely regulated homeschools. McMahon's experience with education is minuscule. She served for 1 year on the Connecticut Board of Education after lying about having a degree in education. She has voiced support for school vouchers, and as a multi-million-dollar donor to Trump's campaigns throughout the years, her position as a staunch loyalist with zero actual experience or expertise means she'll just be a rubber stamp for Donald Trump, moving forward with whatever he and his cronies behind the scenes want to happen in the Department of Education. And for all their screaming and crying about protecting children, the Republicans' big shiny plan for schools will do nothing but drive away even more qualified teachers and hurt our students and all of our futures in the process. Because even if you don't have kids, that illiterate 10th grader may one day be changing your colostomy bag. Might be worth an investment today to avoid that unsettling future, don't you think? So this Christmas, check in on the teachers and students in your life. Also, vote in progressive state, local, and school board members who care more about the long-term development and well-being of students than they do about indoctrinating them with a specific ideology. It's true what they say, that children are our future and it takes a village. And right now, the future looks bleak and the village is failing. If you're interested in ad-free, uncensored access to all of these episodes or learning more about money and politics, eating the rich, building class solidarity, etc., I invite you to join me over on Patreon, where we're planning some initiatives to help build community in Trump's America. Go to patreon.com/Leeja Miller to join. Thank you to my multi-platinum patrons, RHT, Latranger Lucas, Joshua Cole, Thomas Johnson, Anthony Giles, Tay, and Brett Piontek. Your generosity makes this channel what it is, so thank you. If you like this video, you might also like the one I made about how conservatives are sabotaging our public schools. Thanks so much for watching. Have a good day. Bye-bye.